I was fixing my dress when I heard laughter behind me. Turning around, I saw my sister-in-law, Susan, with a mean smile. "Oh, you actually came?" she said. I frowned, confused. "Of course I did." "It's your wedding," I replied. Suddenly, something cold and wet hit my face. I gasped, stumbling back as my dress became heavy with water. I looked up and saw Susan holding a beautiful vase, water dripping from it. She grinned and said, "A dirty sister-in-law like you needs cleaning." My heart pounded. Why was she doing this to me? I felt frozen in place. My dress was soaked, and my face burned with embarrassment. In the distance, I could hear wedding guests laughing and talking, but here, in this empty hallway, I was completely alone. Susan stood above me, pleased with herself. "Why did you do that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She smirked. "Because I can," she said. "You don't belong here." My hands clenched into fists. I had put up with her insults for years, but this was too much. My chest tightened as I struggled to hold back my anger. Since the day I married my husband, Susan had treated me like I was beneath her. She often mocked my job as a caregiver, saying, "You clean up after old people? It's disgusting." I loved my job, but Susan thought it was worthless. She always believed she was better, smarter, more successful, more loved by their parents. My husband and I were treated as outsiders in his own family. I had tried to ignore it, but Susan never stopped. No matter what I did, she always found a way to make me feel small. Just as I was about to speak, the hallway door swung open. A tall man stood there, breathing heavily. He held a bouquet of red roses. My breath caught in my throat. It was the groom, Susan's soon-to-be husband. His eyes moved between me and Susan, his face serious. "What's going on here?" he asked. Susan's expression changed immediately. "Oh, nothing," she said quickly. She tripped and knocked over the vase. I froze. Was she really going to lie so easily? The groom frowned, his gaze locked on me. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice steady. I hesitated for a moment. If I spoke up, Susan would hate me even more. But if I stayed silent, she would keep getting away with it. My heart pounded. "No," I finally said. She threw the water on me. The groom's face darkened. He turned to Susan, who looked shocked. "Why would you do that?" he asked. Susan scoffed, rolling her eyes. "It was just a joke," she muttered. But the groom wasn't laughing. He studied her face carefully, and I could see the first signs of doubt forming in his mind. Then, something unexpected happened. The groom pulled something from his pocket, a small remote. He pressed a button, and a screen nearby lit up. My heart stopped. A hidden camera had recorded everything. The video showed me turning, the vase tipping, Susan's cruel smile. Every word, every movement was captured. I turned to Susan. Her face turned pale as she stared at the screen. "No," she whispered. "That's not fair." But there was no denying it. The truth was right in front of her, and this time, she couldn't twist the story in her favor. The groom looked at me, then back at Susan. His face was unreadable. "I can't believe this," he muttered. Susan reached for his hand desperately. "It was just a joke," she insisted. "She's exaggerating." But he pulled away. "I was about to marry you," he said, disbelief in his voice. "And this is how you treat your own family?" Susan opened her mouth, but no words came out. The weight of her actions was finally sinking in. The groom turned to me. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, though my hands were still shaking. The groom's face hardened. "I can't marry someone who acts like this." Susan let out a nervous laugh. "You're joking, right?" But his silence was her answer. Panic flashed in her eyes. "You can't do this. The guests are waiting." Her voice cracked. But the groom had already made up his mind. "This wedding is over," he said. The words hit Susan like a thunderclap. The perfect life she had planned was falling apart. I watched as she realized that everything, her wedding, her reputation, her future, was slipping through her fingers. Susan's parents arrived, confused and worried. "What's going on?" her father demanded. The groom explained, showing them the recording. I saw the shock in their faces. They wanted to defend their daughter, but the truth was right in front of them. Susan's mother sighed, shaking her head. "Susan, how could you?" But Susan wasn't sorry. She turned to me with hatred in her eyes. "This is your fault," she spat. "You ruined everything." I shook my head. "No, Susan, you did this to yourself." She wanted someone to blame, but she had no one except herself. I stood beside my husband, my dress still damp, my hands trembling. He gently held my arm. "Let's go," he whispered. I nodded. There was no reason to stay. The wedding was falling apart, and Susan's true nature had been revealed. As we walked away, I could hear Susan shouting behind us, blaming me for everything. But her words didn't hurt me anymore. For years, I had tried to fit into a family that never truly accepted me. Now, I realized I didn't need their approval. I had my husband, my home, and a future I could finally control. Later, I heard that Susan tried to beg the groom to reconsider. But it was too late. He had made his decision. The wedding was officially canceled, and guests were sent home in confusion. Rumors spread quickly. People whispered about how Susan had ruined her own future with her cruelty. Her parents were humiliated, unable to believe their perfect daughter had caused such a disaster. Meanwhile, my husband and I distanced ourselves from the chaos. I had wasted too many years trying to gain their respect. Now, I understood that my happiness was not in their hands. Susan's life changed overnight. The man she had hoped to marry was gone. Her once perfect image was destroyed. People who used to admire her now whispered behind her back. Some even avoided her. I later heard that her company found out about her behavior, and her position was affected. The life she had so carefully built was crumbling. But instead of admitting her mistakes, she continued to blame me. "She ruined everything," she screamed at her parents. But deep down, I knew she must have realized the truth. She had destroyed her own life, all by herself. One evening, my husband and I sat together in our small, cozy home. He reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "Do you regret what happened?" he asked. I thought for a moment before shaking my head. "No," I said. "I'm finally free." He smiled. "Me too." We had spent years trying to be part of a family that never truly accepted us. Now, we had something better. Each other. As I leaned my head on his shoulder, I realized I didn't need to look back anymore. My past with Susan was over, and my new life was just beginning. As time passed, Susan disappeared from our lives. Her parents stopped inviting us to family gatherings. At first, I felt guilty, but then I realized it was for the best. I had spent years trying to fit in, and it had brought me nothing but pain. Now I was building a life with my husband. A life filled with love, not judgment. One day, as we sat outside, he turned to me and said, "Are you happy?" I thought about everything. The struggles, the pain, and finally, the peace. "Yes," I said, smiling, for the first time in a long time. One morning as I made breakfast, my husband walked in, a huge smile on his face. "I have some news," he said. My heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" He hesitated, then took my hands in his. "We're going to be parents." Tears filled my eyes. After everything we had been through, this was the best news I could have imagined. We hugged, both of us laughing, overwhelmed with happiness. In that moment, I knew. This was our fresh start. We would build a family full of love, respect, and kindness. Something Susan would never understand. As the months passed, we prepared for our baby's arrival. My husband was more loving than ever, taking care of me, making sure I was happy. One day, he looked at me and smiled. "We're going to create a home filled with love," he said. I nodded, holding my belly. Yes, we are. Susan's cruelty had once made me feel small, but now it didn't matter. I had everything I ever wanted. A loving husband, a growing family, and a future filled with happiness. I no longer cared about the past. My story wasn't about her anymore. It was about us,